Hi everyone, I am Kristen Body, the Events Manager and Membership Manager at the Asheville Art Museum. Can you all hear me? Yes, great. Thank you for being here for today's member program. I'm so happy to welcome Margaret Curtis, an incredible artist. And if you visited us when we first opened, you would have had a chance to see one of Margaret's works in our inaugural exhibition, Appalachia Now. And we do still have catalogs for sale in the museum store, so you can check that out, and some of the other amazing artists we had in that exhibition. But even if you didn't have a chance to see that in person, I think you'll really enjoy hearing from Margaret today. And before I turn this over to her, I just want to go over a few bits of housekeeping for our attendees. I see some folks are still signing on, but you can follow along with what's on the screen. So please note that all microphones are muted by default. We are recording today's program, so if you prefer not to be recorded, just make sure that your video remains off, and both the microphone and video camera symbols at the bottom left of your screen will have red lines through them to indicate that they're off. The recording will be shared in tomorrow's museum e-blast and posted on our YouTube channel. And if you would like to ask any questions or make any comments during the program, please type them into the chat box, which you'll also find at the bottom of your screen. And I encourage you to ask your questions as we go, and I'll read them to Margaret as they come in. And so we have been doing these virtual programs for a little while now, but I know there's always room for improvement. So please do take a moment to fill out the evaluation that I'll send to all attendees after this program concludes. The information you enter is also really important for us to collect when applying for grants or reporting on programs. So please keep that in mind before you just hit delete on the email. And finally, the museum has been open for a little less than a month now, and it's been great to see people back in the building and following our safety protocols. We are, however, operating at a reduced capacity, and we do still need everyone's support. If you're interested, please visit ashevilleart.org/donate to learn more about a new Asheville Art Museum COVID-19 Relief Fund and Matching Challenge. Through the end of the year, all annual fund donations and membership upgrades will be matched dollar for dollar by a longtime foundation supporter. And every dollar donated has doubled the impact, and I hope we can count on you and all our wonderful members to help reach that goal. And now I'll turn this over to our guest artist, Margaret. Margaret, thank you so much for being here, and I'll stop sharing my screen so you can share yours.
Okay, great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Wow, hello everybody. Thank you so much for showing up for this. A couple of little things before I get started. I structured this talk today to be fairly casual, but I'm going to start off by reading my artist statement in conjunction with a number of paintings that are sort of illustrative of what I'm talking about, just for a general overview so we know what we're talking about. And then after that, I'm going to go into a more casual conversation. I'm very open to questions and would love to answer your questions if you have any. And if you're able to stick with it all the way to the end, I've got a little in-depth look into the process of one of my more recent paintings, because it was sort of interesting and fun, and I thought it'd be fun for you. So let me try to share my screen now, and let's get started. Okay, what do I have? All righty. Move that. Okay. So here we go. I'm going to read my artist statement first off. My large-scale narrative paintings explore everyday power relationships. My subject matter is feminist, personal, and political. The body is occupied territory, autonomy won through confrontation. I create narratives that are provocative and open-ended, paintings that are visually engrossing but jarring. I generate imagery by processing the discord created between both clashing ideas and painted marks. I am fascinated by how the same power dynamics that work on a micro level within interpersonal relationships also work on a macro level in society at large. Since 2016, I've been addressing not only the drive towards domination that underlies everything from domestic violence to environmental degradation, but also its mechanics, shunning, shaming, and schadenfreude. As I struggle to understand a moment defined by a mix of toxic nationalism, racism, and misogyny, I often find myself depicting anxiety. I use hyperbole and the grotesque as a means towards emotional realism, reflecting not only a culture of open cruelty, but resistance to ongoing retrenchment. In this world of inverted values, might once again makes right. The cupidity and callousness of the powerful few loom over physical and psychological landscapes defined by vulnerability, whether stemming from climate change, deep structural inequity, or abuse of power. On a formal level, I work out of a love for the visceral embodied voice of the paint itself, the way its physical substance resists the imposition of subject matter while paradoxically amplifying its meaning. Highly saturated palettes and compressed space are meant to highlight the fictional space of painting itself. Surfaces are layered, almost geologically, with areas of translucent underpainting competing spatially with thickly extruded impasto. I try to make the movement of my hand as obvious as possible to the viewer, building specificity through the layering of ham-fisted, or what I like to call dumb marks, a process heavily dependent upon time and accumulation. I use every tool I can find, brushes, of course, but also blades, stamps, bubble wrap, and cake decorating tools, to coax life and mystery from the act of layering oil paint on panel. I'm fascinated by how this provocation of material never fails to reveal deeper meaning. Okay, so now we can speak a little bit more off the cuff. And I'm going to start with a little bit of biographical information and then a quick chronological walk through my work. I have two different careers. My career up in New York, which was interrupted by having children, and then our move down here and the career since then. So a lot of people aren't familiar with my work before, so I thought I'd give you a quick run through that as well. I was born in 1965 in Bermuda. I grew up in Tennessee. My early life is characterized by two very important aspects that are important to my work and to the way I see the world. The first is my father, who was Bermudian and brilliant, a very brilliant man, Rhodes Scholar, but also very cruel. And my relationship with him has been difficult, to say the least. And then my youngest sister, who was very severely mentally handicapped with a syndrome that wasn't even described until the mid-90s after the Human Genome Project. And so we never really knew what the issue was. But she was incredibly important in the way I see the world. A lot of people who treated her wonderfully were the people that we culturally looked down upon. And a lot of the people who were the upstanding citizens in where I lived really treated her very, very poorly. So she was a filter in a way and helped me see past a lot of the false narratives and the appearances that we tend to buy into culturally. My family really taught me that the personal is political. And I'm fascinated to this day by how the micro things that happen on the micro level also translate into the macro level. And I've worked my whole career really in trying to figure out how to translate autobiography into allegory. So I went to Duke, and my junior year I spent in Spain. And I'm putting this up because I really wasn't an art major in college. I was a Spanish major, and but I had the great fortune of being near the Prado. And this painting, Las Meninas, of course, by Velázquez, the first time I saw it, it literally took my breath away. It stopped me in my tracks, and I gasped. And I think this painting has everything to do with how I approach mark making. From a distance, it reads as so realistic and sort of finished and polished, and it is. But the closer you get, the more the surface breaks up. It's not a surface that's rendered. It's not polished, it's not brushed out. His marks are very obvious to the viewer. And the closer you get to it, the more the surface disappears. And I apologize for the quality of this slide. I couldn't get a better one. But you get a feel for how the surface just dissolves into a bunch of globs and quick, loose marks. And this painting was hugely influential to me, as were, of course, the Black paintings of Goya. And I just see that year in Spain as incredibly formative to me. These very powerful paintings, which were so radical for the time, and really did not shy away from very, very difficult subject matter, also made a huge impact on me. So when I graduated from Duke, I didn't have enough of art background or portfolio to apply for an MFA. So I went to the Atlanta College of Art, and I got my BFA there. And at the Atlanta College of Art, I was nominated to receive the Yale at Norfolk Fellowship. And this was hugely formative for me as well, in both good ways and bad ways. We were all there for a summer. It was an incredibly intense experience of painting. It was based around painting. I met artists that I'm still in contact with, and our visiting artists were people like Ross Bleckner, Via Selmans, Ronnie Horn, Robert Storr, really fabulous people. And this program did two things. It made me realize that I was done with my formal art education, because I really needed to go out into the world and paint without more input from other people. And it also launched me into New York, full of anger, and the anger can be a very productive thing. And let me just relate very quickly what I'm talking about. I was working on these paintings at Norfolk that, in a way, maybe to give you an idea of them, it would be a little bit Cy Twombly-esque, you know, very minimal, unimportant, unheroic marks on the canvas. And I was thinking a lot about my little sister and what is overlooked, what is not deemed important culturally. And I said to my instructor when he came into my studio, I said, you know, I really want to make something that is important, but is built of unimportant marks. And just by the sheer repetition of all these unimportant marks, it gains heft and weight. And you know what I mean? And he stood there very quietly, and then he said, "No, I don't." And he turned around and walked out. So this really stuck with me, and it really fueled me for many, many years. I moved to New York, and I decided that I was going to embrace the culturally insignificant and the despised. And so I really started doing a lot of work in researching the domestic realm, the feminine, the decorative, all these things that are looked down upon. And I started going to cake decorating stores in the restaurant district and using oil paint in somewhat novel ways, I guess. This is an unprimed linen. It's sized with animal skin glue, but no priming. And I was squeezing the paint on through these huge cake decorating bags and very quickly and gesturally moving across the surface. So it was both a nod to sort of a more formalist vocabulary that I had been taught a lot at Yale and before, but also a critique of that. I was really trying to embed a notion of feminist painting and an anti-heroic mark within the painting itself. I was really trying to infuse my painting process with notions of sort of a critique of power. This painting is called Pink, and I was working with these floats, I called them, which were monster trucks with the sort of Rose Bowl parade frilly surfaces on top. And I was thinking a lot about the contrast between the visceral substance of this extruded paint, sort of the matter of paint, and the drawn line. And I was thinking of the drawn line as a metaphor for language and culture, and the extruded paint for the physical world and the body itself. So I was playing off of a lot of these tensions of dragging the paint, the line, excuse me, through the paint in very, very quick ways. This piece was included in a survey at the Snug Harbor Cultural Center on figuration as the other side of modernism. And, you know, modernism sort of has a bit of a troubled relationship with figuration and narrative in particular. And this work was paired with a small but beautiful Philip Guston. And I'm going to go back. You can see sort of a similar palette, red, white, and black. As Guston used, and very quick sort of offhand mark making as well. And the floats started becoming a bit more volumetric. And I did a lot of drawings here, but in the interest of time, I'm not including drawings in this presentation, but I wanted to read to you something that Barry Schwabsky wrote for Art Forum in '98, because it really, I thought, was so perceptive in what I was trying to accomplish with these crazy float paintings. And he says, Curtis is drawn to facetious yet pungent allegories that partake of a curious mix of the in-your-face obvious and the hermetically elusive. Among her most striking conceptions, here, as in the 1996 painting exhibition Country Matters, is a series of what she calls floats, essentially monster trucks that barrel through otherwise nebulous pictorial space on improbably large, wide tread tires, loaded down with all manner of symbolic regalia. The exact connections between or meaning of the heaping cargo of the floats is not always clear, and strong whiffs of satire get diffused amidst the ambiguities. Curtis's feminist purport, nevertheless, comically assured yet psychologically edgy, is never in doubt. So from the floats, I started thinking more and more about landscape. And, you know, this work is from 1998. And at that point, there wasn't really the concept of climate change like we have today, but there certainly was, or at least it wasn't generally spoken about, but there certainly was a knowledge that sort of the grand, awesome nature evoked in like 19th century painting. I'm thinking of Caspar David Friedrich and Bierstadt. that this grand nature had suddenly become something very vulnerable that needed to be protected. And so I started thinking a lot about nature as very, very vulnerable. And I did this painting inspired by Friedrich's painting, The Sea of Ice, which I always knew as the Polar Sea, but I guess it's not called that anymore. I did this one, and I'm including this because this painting is so important. I know I mentioned my sister before, and I did a lot of work during this period that sort of revolved around the notion of the pathetic. And what I mean by pathetic is not, you know, something to be looked down upon or judged. I don't mean it in a harsh way, but more the notion of pathos, of emotion, of vulnerability, of sadness, of something that sort of failed but lovable anyway. And to me, it's very tied to an idea of our humanity. Like, you know, we may fall short, but we're still 100% human. We may not reach our potential or what society thinks we should be, but that in no way makes us less human. And a lot of my thinking about this comes from growing up with my sister and watching the way she was treated, and really just having profound love for somebody who really wasn't deemed as fully worthy by the culture at large. And so here's a sort of broken but lovable natural world. The lines are weak and broken and everything's sort of falling apart, and it's a little awkward. And I was thinking a lot about things that are embarrassing as well. And so the work that I did in the late 90s really was about this notion of human striving colliding with human failure and how that interfaces with our natural world. This one is a bit of a riff on Asheville native Kenneth Nolan's stripe paintings, but again, trying to engage this modernist approach to art making, which really tried to strip out emotion. It was a much more cool and strategic approach to content, whereas I really wanted to disrupt all of that, reintroduce narrative, emotion, and sort of the anti-heroic and the failed. In this painting, if you look on the left-hand side, you'll see an area of green. It looks like yarn. I was squeezing oil paint through potato ricers. I was applying it with those grout and glue tools you get at Home Depot. At this point, there are all these fabulous new rubber tools and combs and things like that that I'm so grateful to have. But back then, you really had to look hard for them. But yeah, I was using whatever I could find, bubble wrap, again, the cake decorating tools, anything to sort of disrupt the surface and create a little bit of discomfort, awkwardness, and visual tension.
Margaret, we have a question that came in from Laurel.
Yes.
And your answer for this may be different from your New York works as opposed to your current ones, but she was wondering if you plan out your work or just create as you go.
These early pieces, I had an idea of what I wanted to do, but I really did not sketch them out. The sketching out aspect of it was part of the painting of it. My more current work, however, is it's much more involved in a way, and I do sketch them out pretty thoroughly before starting. So this is, again, sort of late in my time at in New York, and I was thinking about our vanishing natural forms, how vulnerable the forms are, but how nature in our mind was becoming less about the specific forms, as species go extinct and as we face environmental degradation, but more, nature was becoming more the forces of nature, which, hurricanes, wind, entropy, sunlight, erosion, all these things that will not change. And so our human striving, here we are, here's these wooden flowers that are built sort of shoddily, and they're sort of falling apart, and they're really not going to last very long, are being eroded by the forces of nature. So sort of this interaction between human activity and natural forces. And I was able to go to this collector's house not too long ago, and I actually have a couple, because I apologize for the quality of these slides. These reproductions, they're very old and from slides, but this gives you an idea of the surface of these paintings. I was actually weaving paint, that calico, or gingham, sorry, that gingham pattern in the back there is actually woven paint. These are basic cake decorating techniques that I was using with the oil paint. And I was really playing off of different types of illusionism, whether it's through sort of the more volumetric rendering that's typical in figurative painting, or the illusionism that I was creating with these very three-dimensional surfaces. Okay, so here's a slight departure. This is a work that I did recently under quarantine. It is my first sculptural piece, first and only sculptural installation, and it's called A Charm Bracelet of My Reproductive Career. And I put it here sort of as a disruptor, because at this point in my life was totally upended and disrupted as well. We had our first child, and in New York, and he was born with some very serious medical issues, which completely took over my concerns and my priorities, which was the way it should be. And we ended up moving to North Carolina to be near Duke Children's Hospital and to be close to the mountains that I had grown up in, and to have sort of an easier, less stressful home life for our children. But it was a very hard time for me as an artist. I quit painting entirely for a number of years. I felt like when we were living in Virginia and then ultimately here in North Carolina, I really felt like maybe I wasn't going to be an artist again, and that was quite painful for me. But I'm happy to say my son is great. We are very happy with the move we made here to North Carolina, but motherhood certainly disrupted things and put me on a different track. And so now we're going to go into like I feel like my second real art career or body of work, which started probably around 2010 or so. And this painting is a good indicator of how I came back to making artwork. During the time that my children were little, my aunt, who was very, very close to me, committed suicide. And this was this was a very tragic and upsetting event. And I put myself into therapy to deal with it. And I remember talking to my therapist about, everything that one talks to a therapist about. And she said, Margaret, you really should write a book. And it was just one of those offhand comments that somebody says to you that sort of sinks in really deeply. And I remember feeling a little upset, like, wow, gosh, writing is the worst thing in the world. I hate writing. But then I thought, I'm not a writer, I'm a painter. I should paint a book. And so this was really my first painting, the first chapter of my book. And in this painting, which is called Proof 1964, I'm trying to paint the world before I was born, the world that I would be born into. I was born in 1965. And it's a portrait of my parents who are in costume, and a portrait of the sort of difficult dynamics of that time. This, you know, the 60s were the civil rights movement. The women's movement was beginning, all sorts of rights movements politically across the world. And my parents, I really wanted to depict sort of the way they were a little bit, the way they played fast and loose with the cultural changes around them, and not always responsibly. I used a lot of what, for lack of a better term, Orientalism, like Edward Said's notion of Orientalism throughout this painting. We've got the carpet, there's a Buddha in the back. My parents are dressed in costume. There's a Japanese painting on the back, and even the trees out the window, I tried to reference bonsai, because I really felt like my parents always played with things a bit irresponsibly, that the world that I witnessed, the adult world that I witnessed, was something scary and that I didn't really understand. And I tried to capture in this piece a feeling that I had often as a child, which was seduced by them, but also really not understanding what was going on and thinking it was very bizarre, and just wondering, what am I seeing here? I don't feel safe. And what's actually happening. So I was trying to recreate this feeling of bewilderment that I often had as a little girl with my parents, who were so caught up in themselves that really there was just a lot of damage that they were completely oblivious to the fact that they had caused. This piece, Loaded, I was thinking a lot about the encroaching, and certainly this applies today, the desire to get rid of women's reproductive rights, and just the burden that, you know, women do. So we sacrifice so much physically when we bear children and have children, and it's just something that is not given enough respect. I feel like we aren't given our due for everything that we bring to this world. And so in this one, it's a rickshaw. Again, I'm thinking about my father, his sort of his Bermudian colonialist past and his attitudes, all the isms. And you know, the male back there is sort of a lout. You don't know if he's drunk or what, and he's, you know, he's not physically encumbered in any way, but he's telling the pregnant woman where to go, as she does all the labor in taking him around. And one thing that I really liked about this painting was I just felt like it was really ribald and sort of like a Chaucerian, actually. Like, this was like the Canterbury Tales. It was just like so over the top, such a bizarre and funny image. And I do try to make my work funny or appealing visually to sort of draw the viewer in to considering content that may be not that attractive in the end. So Toile, Study in Red. I was thinking a lot about those pink bathrooms from the 50s and how womb-like they are. And in this one, this is a good example of how I try to keep my narratives open-ended. I thought I'd do a painting of a young woman washing bloody sheets in the bathtub, and you don't really know why there's blood on the sheet, whether she just lost her virginity or whether she had a very bad period. It's not really explained, nor does it need to be. And the boy in the painting, you know, he and the girl, they're in the same narrative. They share a space, but they occupy different worlds, and they certainly occupy different emotional worlds. He is off in his own little reverie, holding a puppy in the sunlight and just looking very, very happy, while she sort of deals with the bodily mess of the world. And I feel like, you know, roles within marriage or our gendered roles are they often come down to that, this sort of disconnect between what the woman deals with in day-to-day life versus what a man deals with in day-to-day life. At the same time, I'm going to go back. I really wanted this painting to be very beautiful and seductive. Wanted people to really be able to psychologically enter this space, and before they start considering the questions of around the narrative. So 2016 rolls around, and our cultural landscape here in America just starts getting really fraught and difficult. And I really started thinking about cruelty. I was very distressed to see the way our cultural life, the way our country just descended into scapegoating. And I started thinking a lot about witch trials and victimization. And in this painting, I wanted to sort of bring the Salem witch trials and the trial by water into a more contemporary context. So I turned it into a pool party, and instead of focusing on the victim, and I feel like that's something that is done so much, I wanted to turn, I wanted to put the viewer in the position of the victim. We are the victim, and we're looking up at our tormentors. This piece I made, this was my first foray into Photoshop, and I got friends and family at a pool to stand around while I went underwater with a video camera. And I took maybe 15, 17, 20 stills from that video and gradually pieced them together to create this, this image. And as you can see, it's painted very, very loosely with a lot of rubber squeegees and spatulas and other implements. And again, I chose this one because I really am not into a sort of blended rendering. I really don't want the process of how I painted them to be at all mysterious. I want people to be able to go in and see how the painting was constructed, which brush strokes were put on top of which brush strokes, and how this came to be. I see them almost like the geological strata and sort of a canyon wall. And I want that to be apparent to the viewer. I don't want there to be any mystification. And of course, our understanding of what's going on in the world around us with climate change has come front and center in recent years. This is also from 2016, and I have been going to this area in the North New Mexico mountains for many years, like 25 years, and I had a favorite favorite trail that I would hike over and over, and I've been able to witness the degradation of this trail myself in real time over the last 20 years. And I hadn't been on this trail in quite some time. And when I went back, I was just shocked at the changes. It used to be used to be under a heavy canopy of Doug fir, and it was very shaded, and there were wild strawberries and dwarf iris and all over the ground. And so many trees had died from a combination of drought and pine bark beetles that maybe 50% of the trees were gone, which opened up the canopy, dried out the forest floor. It really was entirely different. And I felt this tremendous sense of mourning when I saw this trail again. And so I did this. I felt like a part of me had died when I went back to it. And so I did this painting sort of thinking of the body as a temple, but the body of nature, of the natural world, also as a temple. And so I tried to give these aspen groves a bit of a more architectural feeling, like you're inside this very sacred space, but one that has also been very, very damaged. They're painted very loosely. And this is the one that was in Appalachia Now, continuing with the idea of these witch hunts. And, you know, I lived in Spain for a while, so I was very familiar with autos de fe, which were the Spanish Inquisition's way of burning people at the stake and trying them for heresy publicly. And I wanted to treat that somehow. And this painting came up very, very organically. The figure came into it quite late. The fire was where I started. I had a different idea for how it would go, but it just wasn't working. And when I finally let go of that idea and just started responding to the marks there, the figure began to emerge. And it just seemed perfect to address our sort of political apathy around climate change, our inability to do anything about it, and how ultimately self-destructive our political apathy is. And I've done a number of fire paintings because fire is all around us these days, whether it's Australia or California. I did a residency out in New Mexico where we were hiking through the burn scar of one of the biggest wildfires in our nation's history. And so fire is very much on my mind. And these paintings are done with this very layered approach, very loosely. My work is still very informed by abstract expressionism, but again, always trying to bring some sort of narrative back into it. I also consider this a fire painting. This is Portrait of My Anxiety. It's smaller than most of mine. And I included this one because paintings occur to me in different ways. And the least common way that a painting will come, an idea for a painting will come to me, is when it just pops into my head fully formed. And this one came into my head fully formed, driving on a road outside Tryon. It was just like, boom, all of a sudden I saw this figure of a woman knitting, but completely shrouded with a knotted net of her own making. And this painting took a very long time. It is layered and layered and layered and layered. It has extruded paint and also very thin layers of paint. The orange in the back that you see is underpainting, very, very thinly layered. And I really wanted to capture this sort of feeling of hopelessness that I feel often witnessing what's happening in our world these days. I think probably a lot of us feel that way with our political situation, and how I'm literally tied up in knots a lot of the time. This is also a little bit of a play on Whistler's Mother, you know, but like a really a really grotesque and uncomfortable Whistler's mother.
Margaret,
Yes.
I have to say I relate to this painting a lot right now, but one of my colleagues, Chris, actually put in a question. He says he loves the brushstrokes of the flames in your paintings, and he wonders if Maud Gatewood has some influence on your brushstrokes.
Who is that, the name?
Maud Gatewood?
No, and I don't know that painter, and I'm going to write it right down and go look. Thank you. Maud Gatewood. Thank you. I look
He
forward
says
to
that they're a North Carolina painter, so.
Oh, fabulous.
Yeah.
Fabulous. I look forward to getting to know that work. Okay, so this one I included, and we're getting to the end of the presentation. I hope I haven't talked your ears off, but this one really gets back, it almost circles back to my earliest work in New York, where I was trying to infuse, to embed the content of the painting into the mark making itself. I did this painting shortly after my mother's diagnosis with Alzheimer's. And as I alluded to earlier, my relationship with my parents was not always the easiest. But there's something so profound about that bond between parent and child, and it's bigger than the individuals involved. It's bigger than me as a person. It's bigger than my mother as a person. And I just felt this tremendous sadness when we found this out. And I wanted to try to evoke that sense of awe and sort of the sublime in the old sense of the world as of the word, as something that is too big to fully comprehend, and something that's also a little bit treacherous, like, you know, it's big enough to be threatening. So I started thinking a lot about the early painters, Caspar David Friedrich and Albert Bierstadt, and that sense of the sublime, especially as they cataloged sort of the European expansion through the West. All of that romanticism, which I'm very critical of, by the way, because these were not empty, pristine lands by any means. These lands belong to our indigenous peoples. So, you know, not quite a truth to all of that romanticism. However, it was the feeling I really wanted to try to capture, to describe my emotions about the idea of losing my mother. And so I started thinking a lot about the 19th century, those landscapes in particular, but also early photography and early engravings. You know, a lot of these images were shared widely through engraving. So I decided to create a painting that would be nothing but line. The whole thing looks like a giant engraving, and I chose a very limited palette for myself. This was as close to a sepia tone as I could get. There's actually a lot of color in it, but I definitely tried to keep it very minimalist. These are the guys I was thinking about. This notion of, if you look at the wanderer above the sea of fog, that was really how I was feeling, thinking about my mother, like just so small and vulnerable. Even though I'm an adult, she will always be my mother, and I will always be very vulnerable to her, and always small and sort of as the child in relationship to her. So that's where I was going. And then I did use a few brushes, but really the painting from beginning to end is lines and lines upon lines. I was really trying not to use a brush so much as an imaginary engraving tool. And so it's just layer and layer and layer of linear mark making.
Margaret, sorry,
yes.
just before you move on, we have a question that came in from Laurel that may be hard for you to answer, but she's wondering if you have a favorite painting.
A favorite painting by somebody else?
I think of your own.
Oh, of my own. Um, Gosh, it really does change. There are aspects, I'm very critical of my own work, and there are aspects of my work that I like in a number of different paintings. Sometimes I'll hate something and not look at it for a really long time, and then I'll look at it again. I'm like, wow, I did that. You know, like it really sort of changes. So I don't know if I have a favorite. No, I think that changes according to what my struggles are in the moment with probably with the work that I'm working on in the moment. Okay, so getting back to my family and thinking about interpersonal dynamics and how things work on both the micro and the macro level, and how you can translate autobiography into a much broader cultural allegory. I did this painting, the ice sculpture, last year, and it's really about narcissism. And I wanted to do a portrait of a narcissist, and I wanted to speak from like my own experience growing up within a narcissistic household about how that household is structured, and is important because we're seeing this play out in our our national political realm right now as well. So you have the narcissist, and here we have this shiny, seductive, glittery figure, but he's not sustainable. He needs constant tending. He's melting away. He's very fragile. Ultimately, he's melting away in the hot sun. And you have the family around him. Narcissistic households tend to pit children against each other. So you'll have the scapegoat. And I know that sounds familiar to us on a national level. You have the scapegoat, and you have the golden child who can do no wrong, and everything is geared towards the golden child, and the scapegoat can do no right. They are dehumanized. And then you have the enabler, and in this case, the mother, the wife, is, you know, she's got a fan on him trying to cool off his hot head. So that was the idea for this painting, and I really didn't know how I was going to go about it. So we're going to take a little quick trip through how I created this image. So the first thing I did was ask my very long-suffering husband if he would sit and pose like a jerk sitting at a bar. And I'm like, just sit down like you're some sort of guy who's like manspreading or dominating the conversation. So I did this quick little sketch of him, you know, with his sort of emphatic finger pointing down. And I sketchbook a lot. And I also did pictures, little sketches of myself in different positions relative to the male figure. And ultimately I came up with a quick compositional sketch like this. This was going to be the image, the composition. But I also did a lot of research in coming up with the composition, and I knew that I wanted a Baroque compositional structure with a lot of people circling around this central figure. And so I went back to Rubens and to Rembrandt, and I was specifically looking at depictions of the Deposition or Christ descending the cross, because I figured that would be a good, that would give me some clues as to how to arrange figures around this central figure. So I started, these are both by Rembrandt, and I was looking at these drawings and I'm just like, oh my God, these drawings, I just love them so much. You know, they're so, what I love about drawing as a medium is that it records its entire process, all of the mistakes made. It records the search for the final form. And so they're not pristine, they're not perfect. They're so much more an indicator of like that human, how we all as human beings, we make mistakes as we try to refine what we do, as we try to improve, as we try to accomplish our goals. You know, it's this journey of getting closer and closer through mistake making. And drawing really does record that whole history of tracing to sort of refine the final form. And I thought it was just, drawing in and of itself was just a great metaphor for humanity. So I decided that I was going to keep the figures in this image drawn. And so let me go back, in the painting, you'll see that they look brown. They're actually pencil and ink and watercolor on top of a watercolor ground. And the ice sculpture, who's so shiny and glittery and seductive the way Narcissist can be, you know, he's got that incredibly seductive finish, which you can get in oil paint. It's really not that hard to do in oil paint. Oil really lends itself to that sort of seductive surface. He's all surface, whereas the people are just much more human and much more flawed. So in order to get the visual information to make this ice sculpture, because I didn't know how light was reflected in ice, I didn't know how things would be viewed through it, I decided to make my own ice sculpture. So I filled up Playtex gloves with ice and I froze them in my freezer. I found this weird like ball jar and filled it with water, and I created this ice sculpture in my backyard. And I also made a little ranch house. I grew up in a ranch house. So I made a little ranch house out of cardboard and put it behind these ice components of the figure, and took photographs. And if you look at this one, maybe you can see my little cursor, see the reflection of the house. The house is backwards and upside down, and it's repeated. The house is reflected over and over. Here's a reflection, here's a reflection, here's a reflection, here's a reflection. And that really changed the way I saw the ice figure. Of course, he's distorting the home. That's what he does. He distorts it, he inverts it. He distorts it and inverts it. So I really loved that, and that's something I never would have been able to intuit by thinking about ice. It was something I only came to by giving myself the visual information I need and making an ice sculpture. You can see I'm photographing this on a very hot day, and it was melting away and the fingers were falling off. But it gave me a tremendous amount of information through these photographs. I particularly love this little blob of red from the house in that droplet on the end of the fingertip. So all of these photographs ultimately made their way back into my sketch. I put the sketch, I fed the sketch into Photoshop, and then pieced together aspects of these photographs, little bits of these photographs into the sketch to create the final sketch. And you can see maybe in his head how the eyelids are upside down inverted houses. The line here, the shadow along his nose, is an upside down inverted house. This dark line in his hair, upside down inverted house. Over and over and over again, he distorts and inverts the home. And for me, that was just a huge part of the content. In this image, you can see sort of the contrast between the oil painted, very seductive, painterly surface, and then the drawn surface, which is not perfect. You can see that I'm reaching and correcting my marks to get closer and closer. But the people are of a different substance than the narcissist himself. And so there you go. That's it. That's my presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen right now if you guys want to talk. Does that sound right?
Sure. No, we don't. If anyone does have any questions to send in, please feel free. I I was actually really enjoying this last painting particularly. Based on what you were saying about the family, the children, the mother being of a different substance, and there's that scapegoat child and then the golden child. But I was really interested by the one child holding that little matchstick
Yes.
that's lit up to the father figure and what that represents, because I imagine they're possibly the scapegoat child, but they also are maybe not quite as enraptured with this figure, and they're trying to almost take him down with whatever little thing they could do, even if it's just a little strike of a match. And I was hoping you could speak about that,
Yeah, well,
child a little bit.
sure, sure. Well, basically, I was the family scapegoat. If you haven't been able to tell already, I sort of ran away and went off to New York to make my way in the world. And while there was hardship in that initially, especially when I was a teenager and in my 20s, I've really come to be very grateful for having been the scapegoat, because there's a lot of freedom in that. You can get away and you can go out into the world and build your own life. And so, yeah, she is sort of holding him accountable. She's like holding the light up, the flame, and melting him. She's sort of taking him down a little bit, showing that he's not this powerful figure. He's really quite fragile and ephemeral.
I love that. Well, let's see. Ursula is asking if you can talk a little bit more about why you became more interested in painting in a more representational way after New York.
Yes, yes. Well, that had everything to do with having children. I felt like I really do like my work, the work I did in New York, but it was very abstracted in a way, conceptually abstracted. And after I had children and I really confronted, my first child was born with some very serious medical issues, and that brought up a lot of my feelings from my childhood with my younger sister. I really felt the need to care for him and to give him the best start in the world that I possibly could. So when I had children, it really took me back into my nuclear family as a child in a way that I really hadn't had to think about that or confront those issues before. I really just tried to put it behind me in a lot of ways. And so I felt like I had to look at it harder. And I really had not painted the figure. I mean, I taught at SBA and we did like figure painting and stuff like that, but I had never painted the figure in my own work. And so I needed to teach myself how to do that in a way that I felt was artistically valid for myself. So, around the time of the birth of my second child, I started painting again, and it had been years since I'd painted. I remember I'm pregnant with my second child, and my little one is crying himself to sleep at night because we made all the parenting mistakes that people do, and he didn't learn to fall asleep on his own until he was several years old. And so he's in bed crying, and I decided I would deal with the stress of that by painting portraits of my husband. So that's when I started painting again and really started learning how to turn a face, how to, what level of realism was interesting to me, how volumetric I wanted to get, how flattened I wanted the space to be, how to layer the paint in a way that was interesting. So that took a while. It took several years of making a lot of mistakes before I felt confident in being able to render a figurative painting in a way that was satisfying to me.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Margaret. We're a little over time, so I think we'll end here. But if anyone else has any questions that occur to you after the fact, please feel free to share them with me and I can pass them on to Margaret. thank you so much. This was a really fascinating talk, and I'm so glad you could be here with us today. And thank you to our members for also attending. As a reminder, I'll send out the evaluation in just a little bit, and I hope you'll take a few moments to fill it out. So I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you again. I hope to see you in the gallery soon.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you for this opportunity. Bye, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you for
Bye.
coming.